And the the topic I want to address today, and it's a continuation of where we
There's
left off
people
last
in
week,
my room to watch games
is
with me.
the fact that there has now been,
That's the
since
way
we last
I said
spoke,
I
an,
just
an
tuned in.
apparent second assassination attempt, at least an assassination plot. I guess it didn't get to the level of an attempt. Fortunately, the Secret Service was able to intervene and prevent the would-be assassin from ever getting a shot off. But having said that, I do think we need to take stock of the fact that there have been two efforts now to kill one of the main candidates in this election, the candidate who is the nominee of the one of our two main parties, Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, and that this occurs in a context of growing violence in the United States. I'll say a little bit more about this. Um, One of the ways in which I'm trying to get a better understanding about what's happening at this election, and I think it's really interesting to think about this for a moment. Let me pull out of the slides for a moment because I think this maybe doesn't need all the imagery. Um, we are about to have a national election that will almost certainly be decided in roughly 40 counties in 7 or 6 states, right? It's given what happened this week in North Carolina, it's certainly the case that it looks like North Carolina maybe should be added to our short list of swing states, and now we're up to 7. But I think even more than that, right? The word that's being used these days is flippers, people who flip back and forth in terms of their presidential vote, voted for Obama, voted for Trump, voted for Biden. Who are they going to vote for in 2024? They're really located in maybe 40 counties in those 7 states. And when we're relying on national polls or state polls, and I do a lot of this, and I'll share some of that information with you, we're really trying to infer what's going to happen with a few 100,000 people who live in very specific areas based on a whole bunch of people who may be, in fact, quite different from them. And so I've been listening to some reporting on focus groups. I've been trying to get as much information about these voters in particular. And I think a really important subgroup of them are the disgruntled Republicans, right? So Republicans who don't like the direction that their party has gone in over the decade that Donald Trump has been the leading figure in the Republican Party. And I'll just point out to you that there are also disgruntled Democrats, and I'm not getting as much information about them, but people who think the party went too left or didn't like Hillary Clinton, and whether or not they will come home around Kamala Harris is an interesting question. But having said all of that, the disgruntled Republican voters, one of the things I heard from one of the focus groups is, look, it's too bad that there's an assassination attempt on Donald Trump. But having said that, we also remember what he said about Scott Pelosi. We also remember that he motivated people to invade the Capitol. We also remember that he stood up for vigilantes who attended Black Lives Matter and brought Black Lives Matters rallies and brought, automatic weaponry and body armor to political protests. And so we're not actually gaining in sympathy for Donald Trump, despite the fact that he quote took a bullet, right? And that generally creates a rally round kind of phenomenon. But having said that, I want to note, right, that this is a level of desensitization to violence, that's part of it. But I also want to suggest it's a troubling indication of how radicalized our politics has become, how much the norms that surround democracy have been eroded. And so having said that, let me now get back into the slides. And by the way, I'll just be very brief about this. I'm deeply troubled by what's happening in Israel and Lebanon right now, and what appears to be playing with matches next to a powder keg, and the substantial risk that there could be a real escalation of that conflict in ways that could draw other countries, including Iran, in, potentially the United States as well. We'll talk more about that in another occasion, but I don't want to completely sideline that to talk about domestic politics. The world doesn't stand still while we have elections. The world is an incredibly dangerous place. And I will just note very quickly, it appears that the main reason that Israel didn't invade southern Lebanon when Hezbollah started lobbing rockets into northern Israel in the immediate aftermath of the invasion by Hamas, right, in southern Israel. So two different borders, in a sense, two different conflicts, but the right sympathy between Hamas and Hezbollah, Hezbollah's effort to support Hamas and maybe occupy some of the Israel's military might. This is, it's, I think, poorly understood or easily forgotten that Joe Biden went to Israel a week after the October 7th attacks and lobbied, right, publicly talked about the mistakes that we in the United States made in the aftermath of our parallel attacks, the September 11th, 2001 attacks, and urged Israel to seek justice, but to not do so in a way that ultimately got them into wars they could not win. And by all accounts, that was accompanied by Biden and Blinken and others, including American military officials, lobbying behind the scenes to keep Israel from invading southern Lebanon on October 8th, October 9th, October 10th, the week after, 2 weeks after. And apparently there was real support within the Israeli government, even some within the Israeli military. And so the intertangling of domestic politics and international relations, right? Had there been a different president, maybe there would have been less restraint or less lobbying of Israel to not fight a wider war. If there is a different president a few months from now, will that president have the mindset, the wherewithal, the disposition to also try to prevent a war from escalating when it seems clear that there are powerful forces within Israel, within Iran, that may want to escalate this war? That they're certainly walking a tightrope right now, where it appears one bad step could get them over that edge. Ruth, were you raising your hand? I couldn't tell. No, okay, all right. So let me, having just noted that because it's on my mind, because I think it should be something we're all paying attention to, now return to what I want to talk with you about today, and do so with the slides, and remind you that we left off on a topic that I think was really quite directly related last week. And so I want to talk about violence, disinformation, radicalization, and epistemic anarchy today. And so I've got my usual panoply or mosaic of images here, including images of the Capitol being invaded, images of Donald Trump having taken a bullet, images that have to do also with the fact that Donald Trump is very much caught up in the legal system, which is arbitrating what happened on January 6th and other aspects of alleged criminality. And he's attempting to deny that this is anything but a political witch hunt. And so when I say we're in an atmosphere of epistemic anarchy, part of what is at stake in this election is whose version of the truth, which version of the truth is going to prevail. And to be as clear as possible, I don't think that the concept of the truth is completely relativistic, such that really there are two equal versions, and just the question is which one do we prefer? I think that there is truth and there is falsity, and that on core issues of fact, yes, interpretive schemas matter. Yes, there's room for adjusting facts around the perimeter and maintaining core beliefs, but ultimately, there is truth and there is falsity. But then I want to add, we live in an era of lie machines. We live in an era in which social media and our digital media system circulate lies as readily as truth. And in many ways, that because the architecture of our new digital public sphere is fundamentally constructed by algorithms, algorithmic recommendation systems that are governed by artificial intelligence, that are created by commercial for-profit enterprises, and that are primarily designed to capture the attention of their users, that what captures the attention of users is what has high emotional or affective salience, not what is true. And frankly, what is true is often complex and difficult and therefore somewhat boring. And the result is, right, that the social media reconfiguration of our public sphere has made much of the media system into, right, what Philip Howard calls lie machines. And I want to connect that then to radicalization and to the idea that violence perhaps takes hold better in an environment in which you think that the other side isn't just wrong, but lying, that you think that they have a conspiracy to get you to believe something that you shouldn't believe, or that they've pulled the wool over the eyes of half of America. And that in that environment, it is also the case that you are getting your information from a media system. The term of art being used by the scholars who study this is radicalization funnels, right? The algorithm notices that you're particularly attracted to media content that suggests if Donald Trump wins, Russia will be successful in annexing the Ukraine. And that the more extreme the content, the more it bemoans the fate of Ukrainians who are fighting for their freedom and know that if Russia takes over, they will be thrown in jails or gulags, that they will be, subject to all kinds of reprehensible political violence, that is the content that you like. We're going to show you more and more of that, and more radical versions of that. So this radicalization or extremist funnel that is built into the architecture of social media, and hence the digital public sphere in which so many of us get our information now, this is part of the issue, right? We're in a world where we have different realities, where we increasingly believe that the other side is motivated by false and pernicious ideas, and where some of us end up more and more radicalized. And so, having said all of that, I'm going to pull you back for a second to where we left off last week. And last week I was talking about the debate as representing a post-policy, post-truth debate. And I left you with this, I'm sorry, let me, well, let me remind you, and then we'll go back to it in a moment. Sorry, this statement from Harris, in which, and I will just read the conclusion, but the idea that Trump was lost the election, that he's having a difficult time processing that multiple courts have found this to be the case, and that is because they have clear evidentiary standards, and the Trump campaign, the Trump litigation has failed to produce any credible evidence that the election was stolen due to fraud. And that what this reflects is that Donald Trump has the temperament that leads him to be confused about fact, and that's disqualifying for him to be president. I'm going to suggest in a few minutes that I think this line of attack may be among Harris's most powerful line of attacks. And I did say last week, and I'll just again reiterate that I think the other thing that um, Harris did in the debate, again, one of the focus group members expressed it this way: she out alphaed him. She showed herself to be the dominant person in that exchange. And to the extent that Trump's brand is one of strength and dominance, that Trump's way of claiming that he is qualified to be the president of the United States, and better qualified than his adversary, is by saying he is strong and they, right, Biden or Harris, are weak. That in fact that did not appear to be the case when they got into the same room together and talked to each other for an hour and a half. And again, that may be in particular undermining Trump with, right, those few 100,000 people in those 40 counties who are going to decide the outcome of the election. I'll get back to this, but before I do, I want to go back now to a little bit of information about what is happening in our public sphere. And I'm doing some research on this for my own scholarship, and so I'm just going to present you with some of the material I'm looking at, and some of what it finds, and I will maybe focus a little bit on in particular Gloria Mark's work on attention span. Some of this stuff is just mind-boggling, that the average person who has a smartphone in the United States today touches their phone, right? Interacts with their phone. That's they have, right, touch screens, and so that's the way we interact with them 2,500 times a day. Right, that it's just mind-boggling, isn't it? So that our attention span on these devices has been reduced to roughly 40 seconds, that these devices are engineered to be addictive, to hijack our attention, that this builds on a century-long effort to understand human attention primarily in terms of, on the one hand, productivity. What can we make workers do to get them to focus on their tasks so that they can maximize their productivity? And on the other hand, commercialism, right? What can we do to make sure that the people we want to sell our goods to pay attention to the advertisements that make them believe that the good in question is going to make them happy or satisfy their needs or make them cool or increase their prestige and status, and that this then is part of how we've learned to design instruments of attention that are highly addictive. Wayne Wu, philosopher, I think just moved from Carnegie Mellon to Penn, is perhaps, I think, that the foremost philosopher and cognitive scientist of attention. And the idea that to build on William James' old statement, you are what you pay attention to, right? That attention is critical to agency. We can't really act as um, agents capable of directing ourselves with intention until we're able to pay attention to direct our attention, and that there is a decline of focused attention, that there's a growth in fractured attention. There is this experience that people refer to as going down the rabbit hole, losing track of your sense of time, the idea that we are increasingly unaware of the degree to which we are pulled in by our devices is shaping our politics, shaping the capacity to process the information we need to be able to form informed ideas about politics, but also shaping what we believe and how we understand the implications of this. I've used with you before the idea of the algorithmic amplification of affect, right? That we are more emotional, less reasoned in the way we respond to information, in part because that's what social media do to us. And there are all kinds of, I think, quite troubling aspects of this. Among them, the idea that we have um, increasingly privatized political communication. And I mentioned this a while ago. We're really beginning to see what's happening in this election with the way in which political advertising has evolved. That 4/5 of the Harris budget, and please note she's outspending Trump considerably because of the tremendous enthusiasm that her candidacy has generated, and the way in which that's reflected in this sharp disparity in donations to the two candidates. And so Harris has a lot of money. She has decided to spend 4/5, 80% of her media budget on online advertising. And part of this is a recognition that the people she needs to reach are not getting their news and their political information from television anymore, right? And so the way to reach them is on social media, on the devices that carry the social media, on their phones, on their computers, and then also that social media based advertising can be much more effective, that it's much more targeted, that you can get much more information about that person you're trying to reach. Where specifically in the world are they? Are they in one of those 40 counties? What is their race? What is their income? What is their religion? What is their profession? What are their media consumption habits? And what does that reveal about who they are? And then you can tailor a message that reaches them and only people like them, and for other people, other messages, right? So this is just a very different kind of media system. But please note that in addition to all of this, it is also the case that there are a whole bunch of other people also posting politically relevant information, which may or may not be true, may in fact be disinformation deliberately designed to deceive you. I was listening in the research I was doing to a woman who's very active in countering political disinformation in social media after it was revealed in 2018 just how extensive the Russian effort was to intervene in the 2016 election. Facebook hired her to make her a vice president of election integrity. And then, of course, they fired her 3 months later because what she wanted them to do was fundamentally incompatible with their business model. Take down deliberately false information, Democrats vote on this day, Republicans vote on that day. Your polling place is in this location, not that location, right? Stuff just designed to deliberately suppress the vote of your opponent by misleading them. And by the way, there is a partisan skew to that information, so it would involve um, taking down stuff that tends to support right-wing candidates more than left-wing candidates, but it also just would interfere with Meta's business model, which involves getting the revenues from the people who place those advertisements, whether or not what they're advertising is true or false. We then note that it also might involve having to take down content that contributes to political radicalization. And that content tends to have a narrow but dedicated audience that generates a fair bit of revenue for these platforms. And again, they are resisting being regulated, resisting their own internal staff's efforts to limit the amount of disinformation, radicalization, the kind of highly emotional content that, on the one hand, may get someone to pick up an automatic rifle, and on the other hand, gets them a lot of loyal, hooked viewers. And so this is the environment we're working in. And I am going to just say for a moment that we need to have a broader conversation. I think that conversation will almost certainly have to wait until after this election. But the signs all around us that this new media environment is destructive, right? It's destructive for our capacity to pay attention, which is destructive for our ability to be in charge of our lives and our decision making. It's destructive for our emotional well-being. It amplifies our more aggressive, more destructive emotions. It makes us susceptible to bullying and to negative self-esteem. The Surgeon General, and I'm drawing from some of the information that is in the Surgeon General's report on, in particular, adolescent mental health and social media usage, right? The idea that anxiety, teen suicide, are rising rapidly, and that their rise is directly correlated with the ubiquitous availability of social media when handheld computing devices, call them cell phones, are adapted broadly. So all of that to say, right, that I'm sorry. Give me just a moment. I want to make sure that I'm actually recording. I have this feeling that I didn't hit record at the beginning.
No, you are being recorded.
I am recording. Okay, good. Thank you. Then I won't need to interrupt anything. I was trying to get my uh, control panel to show me that, but let me keep going, right? So right, lots of evidence that this is not just a political problem. And please note, right, that radicalization is, of course, a political problem when it leads people to bring guns to political rallies. But it's a symptom of a much larger problem that has to do with what social media are doing to vulnerable people, especially younger vulnerable people, especially but not exclusively young men. And by the way, girls are particularly liable to some of the bullying. And so I'll just say this very briefly, right? There's a political element to this discussion, which I think is urgent. Can we rein in the epistemic anarchy? Can we reestablish some of our democratic norms? can we try to damp down some of the radicalization? But then there's also a public health dimension to this. This new media system is unhealthy for us, and we need to be thinking about that as well. So, with that as a way of contextualizing what happened last week with the assassination attempt, but also what's happening with the dynamics in the race, I want to return us to where we left off last week. Harris's pivot, and I think it's a really, I think, quite sophisticated strategic pivot to the idea that Donald Trump is, in fact, someone who, perhaps due to this new media environment, perhaps due to other things that reflect his personality and psychology, a man who does not have a clear grasp on reality. And again, the focus groups suggest that when he talks about migrants eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio, when he talks about babies being executed postpartum and Democrats calling that abortion and wanting to do that, that this in particular alienates the swing voters he needs to win. He's damaging himself. But in addition to that, Harris is making this an issue, one of perhaps two or three of her central issues. And I want now to focus on Donald Trump's response, right? And again, this statement from Harris, I think, is carefully structured in the way that many of her answers in the debate were structured. It has, right, the structure. I'm going to make a factual statement, or I'm going to say something about biography, her own biography, and then I'm going to throw some bait in, right? I'm going to try to get Donald Trump to respond to the claim I want him responding to instead of the other stuff that I'm talking about or what he wants to be talking about. And so she has, right, world leaders laughing at Trump and military saying he's a disgrace. And then she pivots back to the takeaway, which might be something to do with policy, or might be something to do with her character, or might be something to do with his character. In this case, it's to do with his character. And so, right, this is how Trump responds. And he does, of course, take the bait, sorry. And he did this again and again. And Maggie Haberman, interviewed on Fresh Air earlier this week. Actually, you may know her. She won the Pulitzer Prize in the New York Times for her reporting on Trump. She's one of the reporters who's been following Trump for the longest and who Trump actually seems to talk to on a somewhat regular basis, says that Trump has said that where he comes from or his approach to the world is you never let an attack go unanswered. And it appears that Harris understood this and on the basis of that decided to lace her answers with attacks that she thought Trump would find irresistible in terms of answering. And Trump does talk to the point that world leaders are laughing at him. He says, let me just tell you about world leaders. And I this is the very beginning of his response, right? Viktor Orban, one of the most respected men, they call him a strong man. He's a tough person, smart, prime minister of Hungary. Please note, and I think this is extremely important, right? That Donald Trump goes straight to Viktor Orban. It's not only important because, of course, Viktor Orban is the inspiration for Project 2025. And so if you're following that issue, and again, Project 2025 is very important to some of these flippers, some of these swing voters. But having said that, right, the idea that he's talking about Viktor Orban must have his campaign staff pulling their hair out, but it's more than that. I think it's also that Trump is saying, I don't care what the leader of Germany or France or Australia or Japan has to say about me. I don't think they're strong, and so I don't think we should respect their opinions, and in particular on a matter of fact, right? The issue in Harris's comment, the issue that has been raised by the moderators is you tried to overturn an election that you lost and you still maintain that you won and that you are going to go after people who engage in election fraud, quote unquote, in this election. He is saying essentially, listen to Viktor Orban, don't listen to the American judiciary, don't listen to journalists, don't listen to experts. And this reflects Donald Trump's theory of truth, theory of how matters of fact are established. They're established via strength, via will, via the people who have the authority to impose their views on the world. If Viktor Orban, who is strong, says Donald Trump is strong, then he is strong and he gets to say who won the last election. Now, look at how this statement plays out. And it doesn't have as clear a structure to it as Harris's answer, but I do think it's incredibly revealing. They said, why is the whole world blowing up? 3 years ago, it wasn't. Why is it blowing up? He said, Viktor Orban said, because you need Trump back as president. They were afraid of him. China was afraid. North Korea was afraid of him. He said Russia was afraid of him. And I've put ellipses in to get it onto the screen and relatively concise. I've taken out some of the examples, but I don't think I'm distorting the core content of the answer. Look, Viktor Orban said it. He said the most respected, most feared person is Donald Trump. Again, note the equivalence there. What does it mean to be respected? It means to be feared. It doesn't mean to have mastery of technical knowledge. It doesn't mean that you respect the law. And again, I think there's a theory of strength here. We've noticed this, right? Donald Trump, when he answered his question about whether he wants Ukraine to win the war. Well, he didn't answer the question, or he at least didn't say he wants Ukraine to win the war. And he showed deference to Vladimir Putin, to the leader of North Korea, to the leader of China. He seems to think that strength reflects the capacity to dominate your society, and that therefore Vladimir Putin is stronger than the Ukraine, and that he will ultimately prevail. Maybe Vladimir Putin is stronger than the President of the United States because the President of the United States has all of these checks and balances and is not feared and therefore not respected as much as a dictator. Again, I'm reading a lot out of this, but I think that there's some pretty clear indications that there is a competing theory of truth, a competing theory of power, a competing theory of leadership that was there in the nominating conventions and is there in the debate. He continues, right? We had no problems when Trump was president, but when this weak, pathetic man that you saw at a debate just a few months ago, that if he weren't in that debate, he'd be running instead of her. She got no votes. He got 14 million votes. What you did, what you talk about, a threat to democracy, he got 14 million votes, and they threw him out of office. And you know what? I'll give you a little secret. He hates her. He can't stand her. Now, at first, this appears to be a ramble, but I think there's actually a logic to this, right? Donald Trump likes to talk about his weave and how his weave ultimately makes sense. Let's try to make sense of this. That what Trump is saying is that Biden would only have got out of the presidential race, would only have relinquished power if he was forced out, because people who have power don't voluntarily relinquish power. And therefore, if Biden was pushed out, he must hate the people who pushed him out because they're depriving him of his capacity to continue to exercise power. I think it is inconceivable to Donald Trump that Joe Biden slowly, reluctantly became convinced that the best thing for his party and the best thing for his country was for him to stand down. And that is exactly what he did. It just doesn't compute for Donald Trump. And so, having said all of that, I now I'm going to get a little bit into the data again, right? Clearly, most people think Harris won the debate, but again, looking at these undecided voters, right, who were basically split 50-50 before the debate, maybe leaning Harris just a little bit, Trump lost 40% of his support after the debate. Harris gained, and in particular, a large number that probably Harris voters became definitely Harris voters. And I do think probably, sorry, I didn't mean to advance quite so quickly, that one of the real questions that I think we need to be focusing on, this debate occurred right on the 10th of September. The earliest first presidential debate prior to that was on, let me see if I've got it right, the 25th of September. Almost every campaign in which there has been a debate, there was another debate that occurred typically in the middle of October, right? And sometimes third debates that also occurred in mid or late October. This is a very early debate. And I think one of the questions we've got to ask is, will this debate and the impressions that it create have lasting influence over the dynamics in this election, or will it be transient? And will, in a sense, what I think is a dynamic in this election, I had a little bit of information on the previous, no, on the subsequent screen, no, about this. I'll just say it, that I do think in certain respects, the underlying dynamic in this race favors Donald Trump. And it favors Donald Trump because there's a strong anti-incumbent mood, because he is not the incumbent. Harris is a member of the incumbent administration, because the economy was stronger under Donald Trump than it was under Joe Biden, and because many people are disgruntled with that economy. Now, having said all of that, I want you to look at the next slide and then to consider whether or not maybe Harris is not just getting a transitory bounce that will eventually fade from a strong debate in the same way that her support from the convention and from entering the race moved her up and then she dropped back down. Will this happen again? Look at this, and I find this to be extremely interesting and important. These are studies conducted by the Financial Times immediately after the debate. Two questions. Who do you trust more to handle the economy, right? And when it was Biden versus Trump, clearly Trump had an advantage. When Harris enters the race, she has a slight advantage. In the aftermath of the debate, that advantage opens up, right? And look at this question, which is a more recent question. Which of the two candidates do you think will do a better job of representing the economic interests of the middle class, right? Harris has a decided advantage. Small business, strong advantage for Harris. Union workers, substantial advantage for Harris. And I think this must be really disturbing to Trump and his campaign. Blue collar workers, Harris has a slight advantage. That's been the core of Trump's base. And at this point, right? 90% of Americans think they're middle class and they think Harris is better than Trump. A substantial portion of the voters who have been Trump's core base think that Harris will be as good or better than Trump. The only two interest groups that he gets a decisive advantage with, he'll be better for large corporations and he'll be better for wealthy people. Now, let me tie this back to what we've been talking about and bring in Max Weber. I've referred to this quotation to you before. I wanted to share the full quote. It's a little bit more than a century old from a speech called Politics as a Vocation. Max Weber says, "This is the decisive psychological quality of the politician." And by that he means somebody who has the vocation for politics. His ability to let realities work upon him with inner concentration and calmness. And again, you juxtapose those two answers that we've been analyzing. Who has the inner concentration and calmness to let reality work upon them? I think part of what Harris did in this debate, and did so cleverly, almost fiendishly, was to show that Donald Trump doesn't have that inner calmness, doesn't have that capacity to let reality work upon it. Hence, the person with the vocation for politics, his distance to things and men. Lack of distance per se is one of the deadly sins of every politician. If you lost the election, it doesn't matter how badly you wanted to win the election, you got to push yourself back to a far enough distance to digest that fact. For the problem is simply, how can warm passion, you need passion on the part of a politician, and a cool sense of proportion be forged together in one and the same soul? Politics is made with the head, not with other parts of the body or the soul. And so tying this in now to this answer, right? And I'm gonna say something that I think Harris didn't say as effectively as she should have, could have in the debate, right? Tariffs on China of the current amount, not a bad idea, right? In part because they're our geopolitical rival, in part because our economy has already digested it and begun to adjust to it. Doubling those tariffs, quadrupling those tariffs, putting tariffs on goods from Britain or Argentina or Israel or Japan or Australia, not a good idea. And not a good idea in part because those countries are our allies, not our rivals. We don't want to harm them. But also not a good idea because those costs will be passed along to the American consumer, and a large portion of our consumers are already hurting, are already struggling to make ends meet. And not a good idea because, right, the Fed just cut our interest rates, thank goodness, for the first time in several years. And that's because we finally got inflation under control. High tariffs are inflationary, right? And so when the political and economic advisors to Donald Trump, if he's the next president of the United States, say to him, look, maintaining the tariffs against China, good idea. Putting these new tariffs in place, terrible idea. Will he listen to them? Will he let the reality work upon him? And again, I think the focus group voters, those undecided voters in those crucial swing states, are pretty clear about this. They're really worried that Donald Trump will do things that are good for the wealthy but destructive for the middle class because he believes that this is the right way to navigate economic policy, and he's not going to hear anybody else out. He's simply going to stick by his guns. And again, trying to measure this in terms of its permanent effect. And here I've got what I was looking for before. Why, in a sense, this election favors Donald Trump. The Electoral College favors him. The economy favors him. The anti-incumbent mood of the electorate favors him. The fact that the Democratic Party had to switch candidates midstream should favor him. The attempts on his life probably in other circumstances would bolster his sympathy and support. And yet, his choice of J.D. Vance, his meandering acceptance speech, his lack of preparation, first for Harris taking over from Biden, which many people foresaw and hoped for, and his lack of preparation for the debate are undercutting some of these advantages. Harris is now actually to a neutral favorability rating, as many people like her as dislike her. Donald Trump has the highest favorability rating he's had since January 6th of 2021, but it's still a 10-point negative unfavorability rating. And I don't see him getting much better than that. I'll make a prediction. Donald Trump will probably get more votes in 2024 than he got in 2020. And so Harris has her work cut out for her. She's got to get a lot of votes, but votes in those crucial swing districts, among those crucial undecided, uncommitted flipper voters. But it seems to me that she may have set herself up to do this again with Biden having gotten out of the race. Americans in general prefer Democrats for Congress. That doesn't mean that they've got a good path to controlling the Senate. It really comes down to Ohio. And please note, as we get more information about this, it appears it was J.D. Vance who really got Trump focused on the idea that Haitian migrants in Springfield, Ohio, were attacking and eating their neighbors' pets, and that it was in part because he convinced him we need to win the Senate race in Ohio. I'm from Ohio. I'll tell you that this is going to work and get people voting for Sherrod Brown's opponent. And if we win Ohio, we probably win control of the Senate, right? And so there's a logic to this, but it does not appear to be helping Donald Trump with the voters he needs to win. And so that brings us finally back to where we are. And it is a dead heat. If we look at it in this very macro, mile high perspective, right? Nate Silver finally has Harris back ahead in the race for the Electoral College. So, right when Biden was in the race, Trump was up. Harris came in, Harris is up. Then Trump bounces back, and now Harris is back by a hair in the lead. Now, if it were a horse race, this would be interesting. It's not, right? All we're trying to do is predict what's going to happen on November 5th, 6 weeks from now. And so, frankly, none of this has any bearing except to show you two things. It's an incredibly close race, and there's probably a resting point, a return to the mean, which is with Donald Trump up. And so Harris has to hope that what she did in terms of exposing Donald Trump's claim to be strong and dominant to be really more facade than reality. And in terms of exposing Donald Trump to be someone who has a poor grasp on reality and reframing that. I'm not going to try to refute his false claims. I'm just going to ask you, do you want a president who doesn't let the truth work on him, who subscribes to fantasy when convenient and then exercises power on that basis? Let me stop there, open it up for questions. I don't want to lose track. I transitioned from the way in which the social media environment of the 21st century is radicalizing us and making us less tolerant, less respectful, less civil, more violent, and the way in which that's playing out in real time in our elections, in addition to the argument about what happened in the debate and how it reveals the very different epistemic and leadership styles of the two candidates. Barbara, I see you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
A friend of mine who would not vote for Trump
but is not willing yet to vote for Harris, is worried that she's not forthcoming about actual policies. And I'm wondering what your thought is um, about her being specific about policies.
So I'll say two or three things about that, and so the first is looking back at the debate, looking at the couple of media interviews she's given in the last couple of weeks, including right the sit down with Oprah recently. It's clear to me when she talks about abortion, she is speaking from a place of conviction. She is passionate. She is giving you specific stories. You can see immediately that this is something that she is going to fight hard on, right? When it comes to what she says about economic policy, it feels much more rote, much more like she's going through her talking points that she's memorized, and she's pretty rigid, right? She says the same thing again and again. There's not the familiarity, the comfort, the practice, maybe the conviction or the passion. And so, frankly, I understand why your friend is saying that. And then I come back to something I said last week as well, which is in a sense her strategy in the debate. And right now we're talking about one debate because there's only been one debate between these candidates and because it appears to be the focal event in this election right now. Maybe there'll be a second debate. Maybe there'll be an opportunity for Harris to do something different. But what we saw 10 days ago was that Harris prioritized keeping Trump off balance over introducing her own policy ideas in greater detail, or I think every bit as important, her understanding of how her policy ideas relate to the underlying social problems we face. And so, again, please note that with abortion, she's very clear about that. But when it comes to housing, the affordable housing crisis, when it comes to encouraging middle class small business formation or addressing inflation, there isn't as much facility, detail, comfort with talking about either the social problem she's trying to address or the way in which her policy is calibrated to it. Frankly, I don't know if this is just a limit of Kamala Harris as a politician. She's just not that comfortable or that good or ready to address those issues, or if it's a strategy. If she's basically decided the voters I need to reach, and I don't know, Barbara, where does your friend live?
Uh, well, she lives in a high rent district.
No, does
In
she live in California?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so so
yeah.
so so
We, we've
she's
talked.
not going to have any influence on the election, right?
That's right.
Uh,
I'm not worrying about her vote. I did make the argument that the more popular votes that a candidate gets, the more convincing the win will be.
yeah,
But you have to have the electoral college, or else there's no win. So
yeah, I was doing a little bit of research on this the other day about the number of wasted votes per state, right? California wastes about 2.6 million votes, i.e., you could subtract 2.6 million and Harris will still win.
yeah,
So, having said that, I'm not too worried about your friend. Harris is not
yeah,
too worried about your friend. She's worried
right.
about a version of your friend who lives in Georgia or North Carolina or Pennsylvania or Arizona, and maybe her polling, her focus groups tell her she doesn't have to go deep on policy details to win them, that what
Yeah,
she needs to do is to persuade them that Donald Trump is disqualified more than she is qualified. That clearly was her strategy in the debate.
sure.
Again, It disappoints me. I think it's unhealthy for democracy. But having said that, I think Donald Trump's second term would be unhealthy for democracy. And maybe she has done her homework and figured out what she needs to do to win this election. If so, too bad for us, for our ability to use elections to gather information to actually come to some sort of better understanding of the nature of the problems we face, to bridge some of our differences and to begin to lay the groundwork for governing. I don't know that this election is going to do that, especially if the Democrats don't hang on to the Senate. If Harris is the next president, it's going to be very limited what she's going to be able to do. But having said all of that, in a sense, I don't want to say your friend is wrong. It's not a reason to vote for Trump, but it may be a reason to have some qualms about Harris. If you're doing the thing that undecided voters do, trying to listen to figure out what her policy is going to be and asking her to share some information that will allow you to be confident that she's going to do things that are good for the country. Yeah,
Right.
thank you
Yeah.
for the comment, Barbara. David,
Thank
I
you.
can see you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I may have said this last week, but there's a double standard here because no one complains that Trump's as general, if not more general than Harris on the policy issues. He hasn't drilled down at all on any of his policy positions. If anyone there is doing it, it's Vance, and the more he drills down, the scarier it is.
The deeper the hole he digs, you might say.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
The other thing I wanted to say is that I thought that Frank Bruni of the New York Times had a brilliant suggestion for Harris. I think it was on Wednesday, where he thinks that she's making a mistake by asserting this position of my values haven't changed. She can say my values haven't changed, but she can also say circumstances have changed, and I need to reassess the positions I've held in the past. And the reason I've changed my mind on fracking, and the reason I've changed my mind on go slow on the elimination of fossil fuels, is not because I don't think that those are good policies in the long run. It's just that in the short run, we have an economy to manage and we have all these other things to worry about. So we need to go slow on that right now. But so my overall values haven't changed. The circumstances have changed. And furthermore, you should want a president who reassesses the situation and who changes his mind, within some boundaries when the context changes and when the issues that confront the American people change. And so I think she can have her cake and eat it too on this. But I also resent the fact that nobody holds Trump and Vance to account on the specificity of policies, but everyone seems to want to say Harris is
Yeah,
too vague in general.
I got your fundamental point there, David, and I'll briefly say, it's a double standard, and I do think it's a double standard that has a logic to it. And the logic is simply that a lot of the people who support Trump say, look, he was already president. We know how he's going to govern. We know what he's going to do. And by the way, we know that it worked, right? We were better off when Trump was president than when Biden was president. And if Harris is just going to continue Biden's policies, then we have a pretty good understanding that we prefer Trump. Right. I'll add, by the way, that Trump has always been a post-policy, post-truth bullshitter of a politician, right? And by the way, that's the same way he conducted himself as a reality TV star and as a real estate magnate. People like him and support him precisely for those qualities. Now, fortunately, they're not a majority, right? And the person who says, right, the way Barbara's friend said, I want more information about Harris, is actually doing what I think a good citizen should do before they vote, which is not to say maybe I'm still thinking about voting for Trump. I didn't hear Barbara say that about her friend. I think they're just saying, I'm not sure I want to vote for Harris, right? I might just sit this one out because I know I don't like Trump. I know I think he's disqualified, but that may not be enough to convince me to vote for Harris. I need some more information from her as well. And so that is a kind of double standard, but it's not a bad double standard necessarily. So I do want to just point out what I think of the kind of implicit rationale of, I have to say, they're very peculiar voters. For me, you know, what somebody said about, I think it was James Carville said about Joe Biden. Biden could be dead and I'd still vote for him over Donald Trump, right? You know, that's more, I think, in a sense, the position I'm sympathetic with, but it's not the only viable position. And frankly, a person who has voted for both Obama and Trump, maybe Obama and Trump and Biden, is not probably someone who's going to just say, no matter what, I'm voting for the other guy because I think that Trump is so disastrous. Hannah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, though, a different view, that one of the reasons that people question her ability is that she does not seem comfortable in these unprecedented or unknown situations. And it indeed can make them wonder how she would be in the world stage or wherever, in positions where people are asking her the questions she's not prepared to answer.
Yeah, and so I don't know. Did her performance in the debate help to address or assuage
Yes.
that concern?
Well,
And
it's not enough. I
yeah,
mean, you don't see her on NBC, on Fox, on, over and over and over again.
and you have to give it to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a media hound. He will take practically any interview with any local station, and frankly, in part, he's in this enviable position where there's probably nothing he can say that disqualifies him as far as his core supporters are concerned, and that gives him a great deal of cushion and latitude to just sound off and, talk about sharks and batteries and boats sinking if he wants to, right? Just, crazy stream of consciousness stuff. He's a pretty unfiltered person, and apparently a fair number of people like him for that quality. And I'll just say, you know, uh, Barack Obama strikes me as actually kind of a well-adjusted human being. But it's not very often you get a well-adjusted human being as president, right? And it may very well be that Harris struggles in these situations and struggles when she can't be prosecutorial, and when you're sitting down with Oprah Winfrey or a friendly audience is asking you about your immigration policy, it's a little harder to maybe for her to figure out how to answer. She's just not comfortable in that environment in the way that Donald Trump is, or Bill Clinton was, or Barack Obama was. And that is, I think, obvious at this point in the campaign. And I don't know how much she will be able to address that in the less than 6 weeks left, or maybe it's a little bit more than 6 weeks. Wilma, go ahead. You got to unmute yourself. There you go.
I wonder about the power of self-branding, because I've heard Republicans say, I don't like Trump. I don't, they just don't like that whole package that they're being asked to embrace. But I've always been a Republican. They can't cross that line, no matter what, they can't bring themselves to vote for a Democrat. And there are, I think there's power in that.
Well, so here I want to point out, right, that Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney, Kissinger, the 200 prominent Republicans have recently endorsed Harris, right? That Mike Pence, Donald Trump's vice president, refuses to endorse Donald Trump in 2024. That over 100 Donald Trump staffers have endorsed Harris. And obviously I don't want to just sound like a Kamala Harris advertisement. What I am saying is that it seems to me that part of the reason Harris has recruited these people, and she has actively recruited them to endorse her. And part of the reason she says repeatedly, look, if you're a Republican who doesn't like Donald Trump, there's room for you in my coalition, is because she knows, right? We are hyper polarized. And the idea of voting for Hillary Clinton in 2016 was just anathema, just like swallowing poison to many Republicans. She's trying to leave an opening for Republicans to be able maybe to hold their nose, but to vote for her if the alternative is Donald Trump. And so I do think there's some work being done to overcome the degree to which we are so cast in stone in our partisan identities. John Campbell's pointing out that we should check out Peggy Noonan's column in the Wall Street Journal today. John, you want to give us a quick rundown on it? You say Harris is an artful dodger. Is that right?
Harris is an artless dodger is the name of it. It's
Artless. Okay.
a very, very good column. She evades every question of substance, leaving voters a choice between awful and empty.
Yeah.
That's the Wall Street Journal, I assure you. It's not a friendly newspaper to Democrats generally, but it's a very, very good column.
And Peggy Noonan, not friendly to Democrats generally speaking, but look,
She hates Donald Trump, so that's a help too. But.
Right. I mean, and I don't know how much of this is Harris's strategy, right? How much of this is Harris's personality or her degree of passion or lack of passion, degree of interest or lack of interest. And so I would say that I wouldn't call Harris an artful dodger on abortion, right? She clearly is very specific, very passionate, and totally committed on that issue. But when it comes to other policy positions, for whatever reason, she is not nearly as detailed, as passionate, as specific, as clearly positioned as she is on that issue. So yes, I do at least accept part of the way in which you're conveying Noonan's position, and I'll take a look at that. Thank you, John. Anybody else for today? Ruth, go ahead.
Also on her, I just read her article, and the thing she says about awful is the thing that disturbs me, that people will say, yes, he's awful, but he was president and the world didn't implode when he was president, so maybe it'll be all right. And that is the thought that really worries me.
Yeah, and I think that's where Harris's idea that his disconnect from reality maybe is worse in 2024, and that maybe the fact that he's having so much trouble processing having lost 4 years ago is still so fixated on that. And I do think Maggie Haberman is good on this also, that something shifted in Donald Trump when, as he sees it, he was so badly humiliated as to lose to sleepy Joe Biden. That maybe, the idea that uh, that the first 4 years of Donald Trump, I think for many of us, as bad as they were, are not predictive of what will be the second 4 years of Donald Trump. Again, I think Project 2025 also indicates that frankly, Donald Trump might be a more effective president in a second 4 year term than he was in a first 4 year term. And for many of us, that should be, I would suspect, a scary prospect. I do have to go to a 3 o'clock engagement. Flossie, can you keep it really brief? Because I don't want to be too late, but you got to unmute yourself. Go ahead. Flossie, you're still muted.
She's saying, go and be well.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Flossie. I do appreciate that. Thank you, everyone. Good being with you. We'll go back to this stuff next week. Looking forward to it. Have good weeks. Bye bye.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure as always. Thank you guys. Bye bye.